Right, so our next speaker today has kindly battled the fun of travelling across the Tasman at the moment and to join us. Now, as a young industry journalist many years ago, I used to delight every year in going along and listening to the Deloitte Motor Industry survey, benchmark, trying to think what the term is of it long term, but with COVID, of course, that's sort of gone by the way, gone to the side as far as live presentations go, but I always think they are just the ultimate marker of where the industry's at, and of course a great way, if you are involved in them, and working out where your business, where your dealership sits within how the people are doing, basically, and of course if you're in the broader trade, they are a great way to learn what people are up to and which parts of the market perhaps you should be targeting. So I'd like to invite up Daniel Morris, who's a director from Deloitte Motor Industry Services, and he is going to discuss the survey and a few other items, I gather. There you go. Just green forward. Perfect. You can talk on the floor, you can talk from up here.
Yeah, no problems. Thank you very much. So yes, I had the pleasure of first time in 3 years doing international travel. I sat in the tarmac for 3 hours for a 3-hour flight, so coming across for 6 hours was obviously quite interesting. The good news is obviously for New Zealand tourism, there was a lot of people on the flights that were full and coming across, so it's great to see. And as Richard said, unfortunately, obviously with COVID, for a lot of things, we've had to go back to a lot of digital rather than these face-to-face events. And this is the first time in 3 years we've been able to come back across and do a lot more face-to-face, and we're really looking forward to it. So I guess with that, I wanted to say good morning to everybody, and obviously I'm hoping everyone's had a good week so far. If not, good news is you're ending your day at a brewery, or starting your day at a brewery. I don't know which way is better to see, but it's great that we've got AutoTalk today who have really put on this event. So I'd also like to thank them for hosting us and also the invitation to come across and talk more about the automotive industry. So just a quick introduction on myself. My name is Daniel Morris. I'm a director in the Motor Industry Services team. I've been in the automotive industry for a little bit over 13 years. Now, hearing the name Deloitte, you probably look at me and think I'm an accountant. I'm actually very far from it. Like many in our motor industry services team, working in the automotive industry in distribution, also working in dealerships and with OEMs. So quite versed in the sense of, I guess, the different relationships and the interdependency that we have. But that's not to say that Deloitte isn't full of a lot of accountants, and they can be trying to deal with on a day-to-day basis. But I guess in saying that and having Simon kick off this morning, it was really, really interesting. So the information that I want to go through a little bit today just talks, I guess, some of the points that Simon was talking about, particularly around inflation, unemployment, and really what that has, I guess, really meant from the automotive industry as a total. So 2022 has really been a really, really big year. As the world still manages and learns to manage with COVID, we're in a unique market at the moment, which is creating some really unique situations and circumstances. And these are what we've been experiencing that Simon spoke about. And these are lingering supply issues, inflation from overseas conflicts. We've had economic headwinds in the local market, evolving customer behaviours, and that's come out a lot and continues to. That's also starting to also work within our workforce and our teams. And also that changing regulatory environment, let it be something around environmental factors and where we're starting to go. Now, while there is much changing, at the same time, some of this is short-term and some of it is literally a bit of a distraction. But today we're going to aim to try to sort through some of that chaos and to try and talk about what the last few years has been about, but also provide some insights on those trends and some of them that are fleeting and the ones that are maybe here to stay just that little bit longer. We do have a bunch of data and numbers. As I said, we do have accountants that work in the team, but my job here today is try to put the picture behind the numbers. So to do this, what we will be using a lot today, just for a bit of basis and understanding, is Deloitte's e-Profit Focus system. So the e-Profit Focus actually collects benchmarking data from dealerships. So we collect from 250 dealerships in New Zealand, which goes back over 20 years. So that allows us to give unprecedented insights and analytics on where we've been and where we're going towards. So let's start by understanding the big picture in the economy. Now, there are a bunch of economic factors that we can talk about, but we are going to focus on the big three and the ones that are driving our current conditions and which are also impacting the auto market and dealers the most. Now, the key driver is inflation, which Simon spoke about this morning, as after weathering the lockdowns and closed borders and supply constraints, like many of the rest of the world, and that general uncertainty that came for it, it did start to surge in mid-2021, and effectively that did the damage. The flow-on effect, though, is unemployment has also hit all-time lows at 3.2%, and that happened in early 2022. And that was partly due to the migration outflows as borders reopened in March this year. So what is also expected to start to happen, kind of is starting to see it now, but really getting into the end of this year and early next year, is that we are starting to start to see that reverse a little bit more as the new work visas do start to come on from July. So again, the areas that we've been talking about. Now, this cocktail of a very tight labour market, good global supply chain disruptions, rising fuel prices, and that inflation jumps to levels that we haven't seen since 1990. And again, where we start to talk about other worlds and different economies, we're all starting to see these types of numbers, let it be Australia, New Zealand, or Europe. We're starting to see a lot of highs and lows that haven't been seen in nearly 20 to 40 years. But then we add to the mix, particularly in New Zealand, the conflict in Europe, and 2022 has maintained that pressure on energy and commodity prices. So this has increased the cost of inputs into businesses and also the cost of living to consumers. And that's then starting to have an impact, and we're starting to see it particularly in the second half of this year on both business and consumer confidence. Now, this has prompted much more monetary policies from the governments, which has also seen interest rate rise 8 times in 12 months, and which has moved that official cash rate from 0.5 to 3.5%. And this result has led GDP to grow, I guess that growth that we started to see about, I guess it kind of got to about 5% in 2021. It has come back down to 3% in 2022. Now, if I can jump forward trying to talk about the next 12 months, it is forecasted that this will also come back again to about 2%, and that's according to the OECD. Interesting though, while this is clearly a reduction in our recent times, the OECD expects that there is enough pent-up tourism, particularly with the COVID lockdown borders, and to keep the economy growing steadily, at least in the 2022 and 2023 period. And again, a lot of the areas that Simon was talking about, how do we start to bring that back through? So what does the economic conditions mean for the automotive industry and its lenders and dealers? Well, let's just jump to the straight bottom line, and that's, I guess, what we're here to say today. Dealer profitability has fallen during the course of 2022 calendar year. That is evident. I'll also note that the numbers on the screen, just for complete clarity, also include any government incentives that have also come out over that period of time, so where they've been captured. So while the average New Zealand dealer in the eProfit Focus database saw net profit a percentage of sales of around 4% for most of 2020 and 2021, that has definitely fallen away in 2022 to about 1.3% in quarter 3. Now, so many dealers that we do talk to in New Zealand are telling us how much they are feeling this, and they're feeling that what this drop is starting to say within the business. And the data that we've got does start to tell the story. But the question that we've got to pose is, what is that story? Well, profitability right now is definitely less than what it was 12 months ago. However, there is a broader perspective to consider here. And that is, if we look back to prior COVID, so if we start to think about 2019, which I know for myself feels like a lifetime ago, we see that the current levels of the average dealer profit are similar to those levels, and we'll get into that a little bit later in the slides. But what we will explain here is that the makeup and how we get to those levels has shifted since COVID, and that's actually the real interesting part in the insights from the data. But first, let's just understand what was behind the 4% returns in 2020 and 2021, and more importantly, why have they gone away? So as we know, a typical dealership generates profit from 5 areas, and that is new cars, used cars, F&I, parts, and finally service. And for a quick, I guess, accounting lesson for everybody, and if I can make accounting 101 literally a one sentence, we call this selling gross profit or departmental grosses on which way you want to refer to it, and it simply reflects the profit coming from the core operating units of our business. So on top of this, dealers can also obtain bonuses through the OEMs, And out of this total pocket of I guess, selling gross profit and the bonuses, they pay their overheads, such as rent, and then what is simply left is the net profit before tax. So when we want to understand the financial shape of an operation, we look at this mix of selling grosses and profit across the businesses. And as we can see from the left-hand side of the chart, leading into COVID, the average New Zealand dealer was achieving around 42 to 44% of their total selling gross profit from the front end of the business. Front end being new, used, and F&I. But as COVID then started to take hold in 2020 and continuing through to 2021, that amount of selling gross profit significantly grew by 50%. Which then was, again, driven mostly by the growth of profit, particularly in the new vehicles, and for a period of time in used vehicles. So as a result, the proportion of the gross coming from that front end shifted from, again, those mid to low 40s to over 60%, and it stayed there until the middle of this year. So the next question is, what was driving that? I suspect most people in the room already know the answer to this, and the answer to that was stock, or rather, the lack of it. The supply issues that we mentioned earlier, which are impacting or were impacting inflation, are also constraining the supply of motor vehicles into New Zealand, which we understand. So effectively, it's played a double-edged sword, as the key factor that is driving the high levels of dealer profitability in 2021 and 2020 are also driving the challenges with our inflations. So the average dealer went from holding, if we go back to some of these numbers on the stock, around 80 units of stock pre-COVID. That then fell to about 50 units during 2020. So again, that shift in supply. But then inventories then did start to build back up, as we can see, in 2021. What is also really important to note, and a bit of a distinction as we start to go through these numbers, is that by early 2022, the average dealer was actually holding more stock than they were pre-COVID. So we've gone from 80 down to 50 to then north of 80 again. And I guess with that, if we start to look at it particularly in the more recent data, so looking at Q3 this year, the average dealer almost had 30% more stock than what they did in 2019. It's important to understand that during 2020, while stock was at its absolute tightest, the units being delivered each month across the country were also constrained. So during this time, customers actually started to change their buying behaviour. It was probably an interesting period when we start to think customers going from when can I get my car, can I get it delivered, pushing it out the door, to effectively taking on a join the queue mentality. I'll place my order with you, dealer will put an order into order bank, and I'll wait for it. And it was a bit of a unique situation. Now, the exact size of the order bank and where that, it really did vary from brands to brands, but even within brands, it varied from model to model. Some really interesting stories where people were trying to buy a particular model or variant of a vehicle, and then were simply happy to go to somewhere else because they weren't willing to wait the period of time. So we've gone from trying to sell and deliver vehicles in the same month to a period of time where we're looking at customers waiting 6, 9, and stories of even 12 months. And that was a very unique situation, and for some, it still is in the situation as well. So all of this, in the end, impacted dealer profitability. So with demand strong, supply tight in 2020 and 2021, if we take ourselves back to that period, the theory of microeconomics kicks in, of supply and demand, and new vehicle margins grew. It's basic microeconomics. Now, there was a couple of double boosts to this, which I'll also put through, and we start looking at levels of expenses. As we had less physical stock on hand, the dealer stock holding, particularly around things like floor plan and demonstrator expenses, also started to fall. In addition to that, we also did have declining interest rates, and what we had within that was the vehicles that we did hold, we were paying less for. In fact, for some dealers who actually had even less stock than the average, it became a complete redundant exercise to even trying to bother to drive people into the dealership because the demand versus supply. So we also saw within a lot of these numbers, and you can start to see it in that 2020, 2021 period, we stopped advertising, we stopped communicating, we didn't need to. So we started to really rip out those expenses. And I guess that further led to the reductions. But overall, and this is probably the interesting part when we start to see that dip down and start that slight increase up, was that the lower expenses saw selling gross profit per new vehicle increase from about $800 in 2019 to about $1,800 in 2021. So that was a 121% lift. So that turn that we saw quite quickly turned back just as fast. However, with stock now lower than pre-COVID levels, the unique conditions that delivered these results have all but have started to dissipate. And it's important to remember that many of the orders written in this time were being added to an order bank. So for that to really start to come to play, a lot of these vehicles, and we're still starting to see, going to that order bank are still yet to be delivered. So the full impact of what that stock returning to the dealerships, we're not really going to start to see until we really deplete that order bank, which we're going to get into in a moment. But what we can see from the slide is that the first signs of margins falling and costs rising, especially in floor plans now, for the new car department, are now starting to really begin. So the stock shortages on new cars also had flow effects onto used cars. Now for myself, used cars is my favourite. I love used cars. It's the one part of the automotive industry that continues to change and be quite nimble. And what we saw during this period of time is that customers who couldn't get into the new car market for various reasons. One, I don't have time to waste. I've got to get a car now. But also the driving prices and the margins of new cars meant some people then started to turn to the used car market. And with this increase of demand, did push up prices and margins then followed suit, that is initially. So the key things that makes this story different, particularly in used cars versus new cars, was the cost of the product also rose rather quickly. So for new car departments, the OEMs, as we know, control the cost of the new cars delivered to vehicles. So while they did increase prices during that time, and over periods of time they do increase prices, they fairly stay relatively stable. They're not changing all that often. But in used cars, the private consumer largely controls the market. So we all have remembered the stories, and we've heard the different stories of prices rising, and then very much instantly, consumers want more for their cars, and that did happen. So as a result of that meant prices in the private-to-private market quickly rose in line with those expectations. And then these drives then made it more expensive for trade-ins, but also starting to look at some of our wholesale auctions and where those prices started to go. Therefore, while dealers were able to charge more for used cars in this environment, those vehicles were also costing them more. So therefore, it started to really squeeze those used cars margins, probably within that a shorter period of 6 to 8 months. So even though stock of used cars dried up because we had less trade-ins, and again, for New Zealand, we also had less used cars imports because the source markets that we're getting a lot of the vehicles for were actually having the same new car challenges as we experienced in New Zealand. So the lasting impact on used cars margins were very much short-lived. Worse to that, and again, a little bit taking unlike new vehicles, as the used car volumes then also started to fall significantly below those pre-COVID levels, they then started to play a pretty big impact on the expenses per unit. So if we start to think things like salaries, advertising, because unlike new cars, for a used car, you've got to advertise. If they don't know you have it, they don't come. And floor plan, because again, unlike new cars, we had to have the car in stock. These were then costs that continue, but were then being spread across a smaller amount of units. So these expenses per unit for used vehicles continue to rise towards the end of 2021. So as a result, used car selling gross per unit was basically back at 2019 levels by quarter 2 2022 this year. And if we look at the more recent quarter, they're 5% below where we were in 2019. So we've kind of gone down, up, and that ride continues to go. So the abnormal factors that drove dealer profitability to above 4% in 2020 and 2021, they've all but started to dwindle. And this has happened in an environment with growing inflation, rising interest rates, and declining confidence. But what is also extremely important is that we still have a very strong employment number. So this has left dealers facing levels of profit back at 2019 levels, but with some major differences in the way that the profit is actually derived. And now that's where we're going to turn our attention to. So where we are now is, let's now start to understand how the current market compares to, I guess, the normal, if we want to refer to a word these days, to pre-COVID levels, which would be that 2019 area, and drawing out what lessons we can for comparison. So let's start with new cars. So while stock has returned, we understand that, talking to plenty of the dealers in the New Zealand market, that there are still some pockets of mismatched supply and demand. Some dealers actually have customers for models that are still in short supply. So we've still got customers coming through, we're selling them cars, and they're going into that order bank that we did see during 2020 and 2021. And they're continuing to build that order bank, and we also have other dealers, and sometimes the same brand, that have other models in stock in showrooms right now that consumers are not that interested in, and they're taking their time. That's what we're starting to see that stock build up on. So what this is now starting to suggest in New Zealand is that we're starting to enter a phase of two-speed selling again. So the two speeds we have is, on one side, orders are still being delivered from that order bank. And the focus for this side is very much on dealers to make sure that they can still maximise their margins. But this new side that's starting to come back out is effectively the need to move stock on quickly. And this will be the challenge of what we've got to start to navigate over the next 12 months. Because these will be about moving stock on to avoid those holding costs. But the trick will be to do so without reintroducing this culture of discounting. So right now though, because order banks are still strong, the average selling gross remains above 2019 levels, and even in light of that growing stock holding costs. And we'll start to see a slide a bit later comparing this to 2019. However, because showroom stock is now above 2019 levels and interest rates are starting and continuing to grow, there is definitely a growing threat of that rising floor plan costs, and something that we haven't had to really think about and factor in for a few years. Whilst 2019 was definitely about managing volumes in the new car department, 2022 is still more about managing margins without letting stock eat into the costs. And that will be the story as we continue to get into 2023. So let's now go back to used vehicles. And after reaching these dazzling heights that we started to see in used vehicles of $3,900 per unit in the middle of 2021, used car margins have now settled back to those pre-COVID levels, as the cost of the product has still continued to rise. In fact, the average cost of a used car in New Zealand today is about 20% higher than what it was in 2019. So that's then going to start to pose a whole new level of challenges as we start to continue to sell the used vehicle stock, and also, I guess, future residual values as we start to play. Also, after our extended periods where we had expenses drop to below $1,200, and that was not just a once-off, it continued for a long period of time, they've also moved back up to those 2019 levels. What has significantly changed between 2019 and 2022 is definitely the throughput. So the same supply constraints that are driving up the prices are also holding back our ability to do volume, and for dealers to be able to source and deliver cars. The average dealer actually delivered 31 units in 2019, and that's dropped off by about 30% in quarter two to about 22 units this year. And this is making life really hard for the new car department. So off the back of a flat new car volumes and declining used car volumes in 2022, we might just sit here and expect that F&I and income has come backwards. But in fact, it hasn't. And that's very much the upshot we're going to start to look into now, because the contribution of F&I is actually very similar to what we've seen in 2019 levels. So on the slide, we have new car finance, and the reason for that is it does make up more than half of what our F&I income, but the story between new and used is effectively identical. And that is, while volumes sold have declined during the year, the level of overall income in F&I has fairly stayed stable in 2020. So why is that? Well, if the amount of things being sold is lower, but the value is about staying the same, then we're obviously getting more per unit. And that's exactly the case here for the average dealer, which is seeing 30% more in finance contracts now than what they were in 2019. So the question is, why has the income come up per contract? And effectively, there's three main reasons for it. We've obviously got less discounting on new cars, so therefore the finance amount per vehicle is going to be higher. Secondly, the rise in interest rates has impacted the earn per contract. But thirdly, with this order bank, we've started to see dealers be able to spend more time working with customers trying to buy the vehicles to figure out and find finance options that are suiting both them and the dealership. So spending that quality time with the buyers. So if we're keeping score now, 2022 versus 2019, I'll do my air traffic and control moments. We've got new cars is up, used cars is down, and we've got F&I that is flat. And that's where we're at so far. So let's now jump into that back-end piece. And let's now have a look at, effectively, with the time we have our service department, which tends to drive much of the activity in the parts department, which is most the case. So the good news is that even with interest rates that have been rising and continuing to go through and consumer confidence falling off, the retail service work is actually within 3% of pre-COVID levels. So we haven't really seen the big shift there within service. And the real two main factors that are driving that is effectively customers waiting months longer for their new cars are still driving around their current cars. So they're getting service work done that they might not have otherwise put off. And we're also starting to see the customer who are doing service intervals on vehicles because they're delaying their purchase of a new car, maybe because of the different expenses and challenges that are starting to come through. But the overriding factor in all this within our service departments is that we are hunting down service work in face of declining internal work. And that is an amazing and great practice that we can continue through within our dealerships. So the not so good news in all this though, like everything, is that the fall in vehicle volumes has also led to internal work falling. And this has also been exacerbated a little bit further with lower warranty and sublet work. So overall revenue in the service department at the moment is about 14% down on 2019 levels. What this translates pretty directly to is a reduction in gross profit. So all those slightly lower margins means gross profit has fallen that little bit further by 16%. But dealers have also seemed to have adjusted in New Zealand. As that lower activity in service departments, we've also seen reductions in headcounts. So when we're talking about the challenge at the moment, some of us have had situations where we've had people leave and we haven't necessarily replaced them, or we also need to replace people but haven't yet had the opportunity. So stories what Simon shared before around having 8 people to an interview and 2 rock up, it seems to be pretty consistent in so many places. But overall, selling gross profit coming from the service department is still down about 20% on those pre-COVID levels. So we've just hit that 20-minute mark, and I've gone through a bunch of numbers. Is everyone still with me? I still got everybody awake? All right, good. So what I did promise you, though, was the picture behind the numbers. So here it is. Now, you might be sitting there going, why didn't you just start and finish with this slide, and I could have had time back in my life. But this is a really great way of comparing where we sit at the moment. So while the profitability of the average dealer in Q3 is very similar to those pre-COVID levels, there are some notable differences. And they are, firstly, lower vehicle volumes is definitely impacting the new vehicle department, used vehicle department, and our fixed operations. We've seen that. But the higher margins have also set off what has started to happen in that new vehicle market. And the lower expenses across the business, at least for now and where we're sitting, have definitely helped offset the rest, which is then left us, as you can see, a result very similar to those 2019 levels. And just to be really clear, that's the Q3 number. If you look at the year-to-date number, it is higher than that Q3 period. So this does leave the average New Zealand dealer still very dependent on those margins. But the trick over the next period of the market will be a few things. Firstly, we do need to manage the return to stock so that these higher volumes can boost new cars. We do need the cars in stock to start to come through. We need to breathe the life back into our used vehicle market and bolster those retail sales in the service department. And on top of all this, we've got to try and do this whilst also making sure our new car margins don't erode too much or too fast without letting that stock holding get in the way. So that's obviously really easy, jokes aside. So we spent most of the last 2 years reacting to a string of pandemic-related issues. Effectively, we haven't had the chance to really sit down and actively plan as often as we would have liked. And oftenly that time was ripped away from us, as what it did seem for a long time is daily nearly a new emerging issue that came out that had to be dealt with that particular day for our business to continue. Now, whilst the ripples of the pandemic are still being felt and other factors are now creating new waves, it is starting to enter more of a settled period of time and what we're starting to see. Unlike some of the other countries that we were talking about earlier, it's important to consciously now start to switch our mindset and our focus from being reactive and going back to that planning mode, and to start to prepare for the issues emerging across the industry in the New Zealand market, particularly for strong focus on the controllables. So, if I can leave you, this wants to restart, just so you know. The computer wants to restart, so I'll tell me to remind me tomorrow if that's okay. There you go. Hopefully it doesn't kick off. So if I can leave you with talking about the 4 key controllables that we should be focusing on right now. The first one is optimal stock levels. The return of stock to the supply chain is both an opportunity and a risk that needs to be carefully and actively managed in the automotive industry. The boost that a well-controlled stock provides to dealer margins is clear. We've seen that already. But the negative volume impact that low stock can also have throughout the whole business is also evident. So finding that right balance. The challenge of stock returns is to build back the volumes to what these optimal levels are that provides volume without sacrificing too much. We've got to take the lessons that we've had from selling from our order bank and start to continue that push and keep selling cars before they hit the dealerships. And the balance of those strong margins offsetting against vehicles that we need to be able to move quickly in the showroom to minimise the cost. So again, the stories, we've got the 2 different selling periods. 2, we've got to maximise the finance, and we've already seen it's been doing a great job already. As we're seeing, the current conditions offer up a fantastic opportunity for finance. Right now, F&I remains flat on 2019, but as volumes return, it has the potential to lift the profit to above 2019 levels. So how do we start to go from 2019 and kick that a little bit further? But it's also a balancing act, as whilst it's fantastic and important that we continue to work with customers in our order bank to build these strong levels of income per contract, don't forget the importance of your penetration rates and managing the 2. 3, maximising service. So retail work has held up reasonably well in the face of interest rates and inflation, as we've seen, but the focus on tracking down retail work in the face of these declining internal work has also paid its dividends. So our focus now is to continue what that work is and that service work, as well as find that little bit more as we start to put the internal challenges back on and not prioritising one over the other. And 4th is expense management, and something that's really going to play key as we start to go through post-COVID. So inflation, the reality is inflation is likely to be with us for a while. So recession or not, inflation is probably going to stick around for a bit. So in this environment, the expense management needs to become a constant discipline with dealerships as well as OEMs. So as much as I share these numbers talking about dealerships, it's important that the OEMs also have this understanding and put through. And if we start to look at where the market has sit, we are starting to see the differences in those conversations. So expense management needs to start to shift from being an annual budgeting process to something that's happened more consistently. And if we can get our teams to, enter into a waste watch phase, particularly on processes and productivity initiatives, they need to become second nature. Now, as we finish up, I'd be absolutely remiss not to spend a minute just talking about what the future looks like and what it is ahead. So the automotive industry will continue to face disruptions. It has for the last 20 years. You can put up a slide and show the ups and downs and what has come in that period of time. And we're also going to get new distractions that are going to continue to come in the face of the automotive. Some of these forces are unique, definitely to the automotive industry, such as particularly the move towards electrification. But others are also society-wide, as Simon said, particularly around the future of work, but also the customer buying behaviour and where they want to go moving forward. Our hope is that you, like we do, we see the future as exciting rather than daunting, but we also ask you not to be scared of it, but we do need to prepare for it. So continue to focus on your controllables if there's the one takeaway from it all, and to seek out the opportunities, if it, particularly if it offers you an ability to forge your own new future. So with that, and thank you for your time today, I'll hand back to both Richard and Graham. So thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Now, anyone, and keep in mind there is a case of beer on this.
If I ask my own question, can I take it?
Yeah, that's right.
Sweet.
Yeah. If anyone has any questions for Daniel, please do just wave your hand, and a microphone or phone will find its way to you.
They want the beer.
A couple of quick points first. One being that I've been seeing people diligently taking photos of slides. We will actually send out the entire presentation deck to you today after the event, so you'll have those all on hand. Now, I'm just going to ask something based off the discussion. Very simplified question. Profitability is changing, but to steal a line from a movie, I guess the thing at the moment is don't panic. Is that kind of fair?
Yeah, no, 100%. Profitability is changing. It's changing across markets at different rates and trends. So, different countries are going through different challenges at the moment. But remembering where we were in 2019, and we went to this abnormally high, out of our control net profit to sales. So as we come back, I guess the big message is that where we were in 2019, there's the ability somewhere between there and 4%, and the trick is somewhere in that. So it probably gave us the kick that we needed, and I guess for ourselves, what we don't want to be doing here is, I hope I'm not here in 10 years' time sitting here talking about it, looking at this period of time saying that was a nice period, rather than saying that was the kick we needed to kick through. And that's definitely for OEMs and for dealerships. So profitability's there, and it's still going to continue.
That was a very broad question, something quite specific, and we touched on it last night. We showed him some nice New Zealand hospitality last night.
Yes, definitely.
You very much like the chicken sandwich.
I love it.
Now, staff remuneration. You touched on that there. When we got into the process of this supply slowing down and waiting times pushing out, there was a lot of discussion around reviewing how staff were remunerated.
Yep.
Is that something people need to be looking at again now as we start to shift through a different phase of that supply issue?
Yeah, look, definitely. And it was really interesting during the period of time. Every dealership you spoke to and every individual had different ways of trying to remunerate the staff, and there were some really amazingly different left field ways, and then some people kind of remained the same. The thing that probably worked the most, particularly around the remuneration, is continue that focus on the controllables. So trying to get your staff focused on what they can control and remunerating them on that. So those order banks that built, again, that became the challenge, but double-edged sword. It also added to a significant level of retention, because we had salespeople who had sold cars that weren't able to deliver the cars for 6, 9, 12 months. They did stay around for their remuneration. So yeah, as that continues to grow, continually review and face it. Probably more often now than we have done. So within those periods, it might be every 3, 6 months, just to make sure that we're driving the right behaviours in the controllables.
Right. Now, who's got the microphone out there?
Hi, Anthony from Atico Automotive. I just wanted to ask you a question about the clean car standard. If we assume for a moment the clean car standard in the short term will increase new car prices to customers, would that then drive up the used car values again, like you've just described, and even hurt the dealerships further?
Yeah, look, it is a really good question. I wish I could sit here or stand here and say uncategorically yes or no, but as was probably said earlier, is that that's still kind of coming out at the moment. So those effects and where it's going to sit is probably not known, but I guess what we can take out of it and what we're seeing is whatever that change that will go within those costs, it will kick on quite quickly. So there might be a period, it could be 3 months, could be 6 months of that little kick, but then we're seeing it will continue to grow. So going up or going down, if we think that is going to drive up the cost of the cars, then yes, it's going to drive up the cost of used vehicles. The challenge, I think, will be how far can a used vehicle price go when you start to look at the new vehicles, because it will come to a point in time where that gap is not that big, where someone will go, I will just go buy that new car. So it's definitely a bit of a watch and see over that period of time.
Right, I think we had another question in the middle. Oh, a couple over here.
You've talked about the importance of parts and services revenue streams for dealerships. How do you see increased sales of electric vehicles impacting those revenue streams?
Yeah, effectively, the more that we work and talk with, I guess, the different OEMs and the brands, what's starting to come out is, whilst we're not necessarily sure where each of, I guess, the intervals will be, there's definitely a significant shift on what that work's going to be. So there's definitely more of a push towards our technicians becoming quite, I guess, specialised, particularly electrical engineers, effectively, if we start thinking what we need to do. And what that's probably going to start to drive, if we start to see, is the actual cost of the service. So whilst you may not be having a steady interval, maybe of 6 months, 12 months, or whatever that might be, the cost of what that service will be will definitely start to drive up. But that's when we start to look particularly on some of those other areas. And I think the importance around F&I will then start to come even more so. So if we look at it, service, go back even 5, 10 years, not even just looking at the last 2, 3 years, we've always stayed relatively flat. It's never really kicked to that whole level. So the opportunity that service will provide with electric vehicles will obviously change a little bit, but then our ability to then probably start to shift a little bit more of our focus to F&I and used vehicles will come through again.
Just so, following that up, then how do you see the impact of the banks offering these 1%, 0.% clean vehicle loans? How's that going to impact on F&I on electric vehicles?
That's going to be something I think is still going to be interesting to watch. I think if we go back looking at automotive brands, again, 5, 10 years ago, we went to the 1% finance and things to that degree. Anything that's driven, and what we see particularly with the move to electric vehicles, and we had a great conversation last night, New Zealand versus Australia, for example. If I look at the Australian market versus the New Zealand market, the conversation on electric vehicles in Australia is still relatively a fad because it's not being driven by that government incentives and things to that degree. So whilst those 1% and things might start to come from the banks, the question is how long that will continue with those incentives, because there's no such thing as free money, that something is having to fund that and drive that through. So it might give it, again, that kick it needs, but if it continues on, it would be something that I would probably debate a bit further down the period of time.
Just one other question on EVs. Have Deloitte done any modelling on profitability of EV sales compared to ICE vehicles? Because on the basis of low stock, high demand, and the big issue we have in New Zealand is just not the demand for electric vehicles, it's the supply of electric vehicles. So the logic would be that the option or the ability to get higher profits on electric vehicle sales should be there at the moment. So have Deloitte done any modelling on that?
Starting to is the answer. I won't say it's fully through because we've got certain brands, I guess, a little bit more advanced than others in how they're looking at. But particularly the supply and demand is very much come through. When we start talking a lot about supply constraints at the moment, there are plenty of brands out there. I knew even a couple in March this year when we started talking about their EVs, they said, don't talk to us about it, we've already sold for the next 12 months. So that kind of conversation on modelling, it's not probably at its critical stage yet for us to be able to kick it through. But you're right, it'd be interesting to see that change when we start to move away from ICE vehicles and electric vehicles. How is that going to happen? Is it going to be a question that to sell an ICE vehicle, it's going to be cheaper? Or is it the fact that the ICE vehicles are going to creep up in price, making us go, like the used vehicle conversation, the gap between ICE and EV's not that much, I'll start to go towards the EV. So again, there's still kind of two ways of playing it. We've also got these new entrants coming into the market. So again, electric vehicles was all about performance, high-end luxury, and this is what we started to talk about. But then we started to get our entry-level numbers. So effectively, when we do the numbers, about 1 in 4 people say that their next vehicle that they're going to investigate in, they're going to look at further into an EV vehicle. But at the same time, they said they also don't want to spend more than $50,000. So again, there's still that massive education piece within the consumer.
I think we had one more question over in the middle.
Do you see any changes in overall dealership profitability for the brands that have moved to agency?
Look, I think it's kind of a little bit too early to tell where that really sits for most of it, particularly the last 2 years. We've gone through this period of stage where profitabilities have gone up, profitabilities are starting to come down. So I still think we've got a little bit of time yet till we figure out where that's really going to sit. And again, give it 3-4 years or so, that will give us much more of an understanding. The trend, you're starting to see a trend of brands moving there, particularly in Europe. That's probably much more prominent. So I don't think that New Zealand and Australia are going to be sitting there set in the way. We're probably going to be looking at the other markets in other countries and starting to learn from them.
Excellent. Fantastic. Thank you so much for those great questions. Thank you, Daniel, for coming across the Tasman to join us. And don't forget to catch up with Daniel at lunch before he buzzes off to his flight.
Perfect.
And if you have any more questions for him. Right, now we're going to